Welcome everyone to DC Pro Bono Week 2021, and this is Coding Justice. My name is Christina Jackson. I'm the Deputy Director of Washington Council of Lawyers, and myself, along with our esteemed planning committee, are very excited to welcome you to what is going to be insightful, in-depth, and a frank conversation about some issues that not a lot of us may know about. I'm excited to welcome Vienna Thompkins, who is a data analyst in the science program at Center for Policing Equity, as our moderator today. And they are going to lead us through a discussion of algorithmic justice, let us know what that means, and talk about the ways in which AI and other technology affects marginalized and communities of color and low-income communities in ways that it doesn't affect others. So Vienna, I will let you take it away.
Thank you so much. We have an excellent group of panelists today that I'm very excited to introduce. So I'm going to introduce you to each of them, and then we're going to hear a bit about all of their areas of expertise in algorithmic justice. So our first panelist is Valerie Schneider. She's the director of the Clinical Law Center at Howard University School of Law, where she also supervises the Fair Housing Clinic. Her recent scholarship focuses on how technology is sometimes used to replicate or even worsen patterns of housing discrimination and housing segregation. We also have Matthew Bruckner. He's an associate professor at Howard University School of Law, where he writes about discrimination in the fintech banking context. We have Alan DeLevy. He works at Case Text, where he builds machine learning solutions for attorneys. He's also an adjunct professor at American University Washington College of Law, and formerly was an organizer for DC Legal Hackers. We have Claire Garvey, who is a lawyer at the Center on Privacy and Technology at Georgetown Law. She's authored a number of reports on police use of face recognition technology and has testified before Congress and state legislatures on face recognition oversight, accountability, and regulation. And last but certainly not least, we have Naseem Mosheri, who is a policy director at the ACLU of the District of Columbia, where she advocates on civil rights and civil liberties issues that impact the local DC community. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our first panelist, Valerie.
Thank you. Thanks for everyone who's attending and to the other panelists as well. I've been tasked with the easy job of explaining why we're here. So why is it important to talk about the intersections of AI, algorithmic justice, and our civil rights laws? Well, I'll tell you a few stories from my research and my practice that I think will illuminate why I think this is such a critical issue for attorneys to be focusing on. First, a caveat, I am not a tech person. I'm a housing lawyer. Those things rarely fit together in the middle of a Venn diagram. But I see the impacts of algorithmic discrimination in my practice all the time. And that's what's really drawn me to this topic. So I focus on rental housing and algorithmic justice in the rental housing market for a few reasons. So first, compared to white Americans, minorities disproportionately live in rental housing. So therefore, any discrimination that's going on in the rental housing market has the greatest potential to affect minorities. Second, rental housing decisions are increasingly being made not by landlords or individual management companies, but by algorithms that are created by third parties. And then finally, there's been under the Trump administration, there was a real direct attack on what's called disparate impact litigation under the Fair Housing Act, which really would have allowed algorithmic injustice or algorithmic discrimination to go on without any real regulation or a way for plaintiffs to come forward and fight that discrimination. The current administration is not pursuing the same path, but disparate impact still remains sort of under an evil's eye or under attack in a lot of different areas. And that's going to have a big impact on how attorneys can deal with and grapple with algorithmic discrimination. So I said I'd tell you a little bit about how this comes up in my line of work. And so increasingly, rental housing providers are relying on big data companies to assist with scoring potential renters. For those of you who are renters, you've probably encountered this. You fill out a form to move into an apartment building. And it's not that the individual landlord is looking at your form and ascertaining whether or not you would be a good tenant. They're submitting that information to a third party who will run the data through an algorithm that will predict, based on past information, whether you'll be a good tenant. And that seems to make sense, right? There's some efficiency in, individuals making decisions is very inefficient, and there's some efficiencies to machines making those decisions. But problems arise when the data is, the data set or the predictive model is relying on past data that's infected with or reflects a racist reality. And then that's always going to disadvantage minorities going forward. And so we should really, for those of you who are civil rights advocates, you should really care about how these algorithms work. And we're going to have some speakers talk to that in particular. So how does this come up in my practice? So, I talked before about how you fill out a rental application form. Typically now it's not that an individual landlord is going to look through that and make a determination about you. Often landlords, particularly big landlords, are handing that data over to a third company, and they're going to insert all of that data into an algorithm. And there are a lot of ways in which that can be problematic, particularly for people of color. So for example, one piece of data that an algorithm may use is your past zip codes, your past addresses, and whether those addresses are in places that have high rates of eviction. And so we all know that evictions are pursued more aggressively in minority communities. And so that means as a person of color is applying for housing, if you've got a zip code or lived in an area where there are high rates of eviction, notwithstanding your own rental history, you might be subject to an algorithm that scores you lower because of where you've lived in the past. And you can imagine this going in lots of directions, right? Like you've got your GPS data is on your phone, like data companies are going to be able to tell where you've gone. Have you just spent a lot of time in communities where there are a lot of evictions? Just by tracking where you've been across a variety of apps, these algorithms can make predictions about future behavior, and those predictions might be infected with racism. So one thing is just the data is, there's so much data being collected, and it's really unfair to use some of that data, and there's a disparate impact on people of color. Also, the data might be incorrect. So there was a housing advocate in DC who testified to the city council hearing about her client who had the same first initial and last name as a person who had bad credit and a criminal history. And because the data was wrong, her client was denied housing. And there are some studies that say data in general is incorrect with a higher level of frequency for people of color than for people who are white. So to the extent that mistakes are causing problems, they're causing more problems in communities of color. The other thing that comes up a lot is that the data just it's not predictive for an individual. So for example, there was a Washington State Bar publication I read recently, told the story of a woman named Farah, whose landlords sued her for eviction erroneously, and she ended up entering into an agreement and the suit was dismissed. But she had then trouble finding new housing because these algorithms look not at the results of the lawsuit, but just at whether you've been sued for eviction at all. So you can imagine that, again, that might be predictive data in some respects. Like it might be correct to say that people who have been sued for eviction are more likely to be sued for eviction again in the future, but it's incorrect as to particular individuals, and it's more frequently incorrect for people of color than it is for white people. And then one other area that comes up a lot for my clients is racist policing policies. So algorithms can draw on data from arrest records. That's, you haven't necessarily been convicted of anything. Just the fact that you were arrested can ding you in these predictive algorithms. And we all know that minority communities are over-policed, that there's a difference in arrest procedures and arrest amounts or in minority communities. And so this comes up for my clients all the time, where they may have an arrest record that's preventing them from obtaining rental housing. but they've never been convicted of anything. They've just been pulled over. They've been stopped and frisked. They've just had negative interactions with the police that may or may not reflect on their actual propensity towards criminality. Okay. So these AI and algorithms have these real world impacts for clients and for the efficacy of our civil rights laws. And unfortunately, one of the unfortunate things is that the technology can really mask discrimination in this veil of objectivity. So many think computers can't be racist, right? Computers can't be unfair, but there's a ton of scholarship that shows while algorithms and AI can increase efficiencies in some respect, they can also lead to the troubling and unjust results that I was just talking about. And unfortunately, our civil rights laws were drafted before we really conceived of all of these issues. And so that's my personal interest in this topic, but we've got a great panel of speakers today to sort of broaden that and talk not just about this in the realm of housing, but not across all sorts of areas. So today's speakers will talk about the legal implications of these technologies in lending and higher education and facial recognition and policing and a whole variety of other areas. We are lucky enough to have some speakers who actually truly understand the technology, not just the law, which is, I think, for me, a really exciting thing to listen in on, because to really understand how this works allows you to figure out how is this going to impact my clients, the communities I serve, the work I do, your research, your scholarship, and your advocacy. So I'm looking forward to, I got to just kick us off, but really what I'm looking forward to is hearing everybody else speak. And with that, I will hand it off to our next speaker, which is Professor Bruckner, my colleague.
Thanks so much. So I'm going to share my screen, so I'm going to follow on from what Valerie said. Everybody can see that? Thumbs up? Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to not try to retread the ground that she did, but I'll give a little sort of overview of the problem in the lending context, which is my area, so that it sort of grounds the discussion about the regulatory space. Okay, so the good things about AI, artificial intelligence, machine learning in the credit context is, this is from the CFPB. They gave a ringing endorsement to this company Upstart and said they're using alternative data, machine learning techniques in the financial services space. And they are lending money to folks who would have traditionally not received loans. And so they're increasing credit access. At the same time, they're decreasing costs. Right? They found no problematic discrimination in any of the tested categories. So this is terrific, right? This is just what you want to see. I just saw Kat Wellback join from Student Borrower Protection Center, so I'm gonna actually rely on some that they talked about. They have this educational redlining report. So they did some mystery shopping. They looked for private student loans, refinancing loans. They had 2 shoppers that they say were equivalent across all categories, except that one went to Howard, which is fortunate but also sad for us, and the other one went to NYU. The Howard grad was offered a loan that would have cost $3,500 more than the NYU grad. They found Student Borrower Protection found similar problems for other minority serving institutions, including community colleges. Right. This was concerning enough that it prompted a quintet of U.S. senators to write a letter to the company. Now the company contests that the applications were in fact the same and say there were lots of other differences, but we don't have, we should have taken their word for it, at least from our side. All right, so just, pause for a moment to think, what is the difference between the average NYU grad and the average Howard grad? Like, what pops into your mind? Right? Minority students are more likely to attend HBCUs. Black students are much less likely to attend elite colleges than white students. And so relying on college attendance data as a proxy for credit access, as Chris Odenay says, sort of invariably maps onto race. All right, so this is the problem as I see it. So what do we do about it? So I've looked at these various regulatory possibilities. UDAP authority, which state attorneys general and the CFPB has, Equal Credit Opportunity Act and the Fair Credit Reporting Act, right? So in many ways, our fair lending laws are try to enable equitable credit access, but evidence suggests they failed, and they failed even before we moved into this new space with artificial intelligence. And so if they were not successful before, how likely they'd be successful now that we're applying them to a novel factual setting? All right, so talk a little bit more specifically about these. Unfairness, the unfair part of the U, requires three things: that there be substantial injury, that it's not reasonably avoidable by consumers, and is not outweighed by countervailing benefits. But this is not, it's not even clear. What is the harm, right? Is the harm that it's an increased cost for the Howard grad relative to the NYU grad? Or is it the cost compared to a conventional loan product? Right? So it's possible that the loan costs for everybody using AI and machine learning goes down, but that the gap grows, right? So the costs go down across the board, but the costs go down faster for white borrowers. Right? Is the harm avoidable? Well, not if machine learning algorithms are black boxes, but some folks claim that they are explainable and they could be accountable, in which case maybe you can explain what, maybe Upstart can tell folks why they're being charged more money than other people who seem similarly situated. And then the third bit is that the benefit has to outweigh the harm. So like I said, Upstart claims that they are increasing credit access with decreased costs. But I would say that if the gap between the white borrowers and black borrowers is growing, then the answer is no, the benefit does not outweigh the harm. And there's certainly evidence from this educational context. There's also evidence from the mortgage context, just that rates are going down for everybody, but they're going faster for white borrowers. And then these other regulations, equal credit opportunity and fair credit, they use these things called adverse action notices. So the idea is you have to sort of explain to somebody why they have been denied credit or why they haven't been given credit at the advertised rate. It's not clear that like the Howard grad would even get an adverse action notice, right? And so would they know that had they gone to NYU, they would have gotten cheaper credit? If they do get such a notice, the notice might actually be worth all that much to the consumer, right? So it's not clear that Upstart sort of denies that it was the college attendance data that explains the difference. But if the college attendance data is not explaining any of the difference, then why are they using it in their algorithm in the first place? If the input is not relevant, it's not clear why they're using it. And if it is relevant, it seems clearly to map onto race in this context. So Upstart in particular has got a no action letter from the CFPB. CFPB has blessed their decision to use this data, but there's still regulatory risk for lenders, right? Other regulators, state-based regulators might decide that they don't agree with the CFPB's guidance. They might enforce the laws more strictly. And also they're required to give these notices. Now, they only have to disclose a reason for the denial, and not even necessarily a clear and comprehensible reason. But some folks think that even that is too much, that lenders, these fintech lenders, are not able to provide the reasons for the denials. And I'll leave off with this. So in this first item up here, sorry for the typo, there was a class action versus Sally Mae in 2009 about using cohort default rate data. So, did you attend a college? And this is something similar to what Valerie was saying. Did you attend a college where lots of people were also defaulting on their loans? And if so, then they're going to say, well, you're like those people, right? Like you go to a college, just like you were spending time in a community where there's lots of evictions, or you've lived someplace with lots of evictions. Similarly, you go to a college where lots of other people haven't paid back their loans. Well, there was a consent order in 2014 between Fannie Mae and the FDIC to stop using the cohort default rate data. Now, other lenders might still be using this data, but this seems a lot like using college attendance data, right? We're just proxying for race. We're lumping people together irrespective of their own likelihood of defaulting. And I'll leave it with that. So let me stop sharing my screen. Thanks. Turn it over.
Thanks. I think, Alan, you are up next.
All right. So folks, my name is Alan DeLevy. I work on building machine learning models to serve legal research products at a company called Casetext. I also teach Python to law students. Python's a programming language at American University Law School. So I'm just very passionate about, I don't know, bringing legal literacy into the tech world, and then also getting some tech, and particularly understanding of software in the legal world. And I also used to co-organize DC Legal Hackers. I'll just give a very small plug. We have a new set of organizers. Check them out on a site called Meetup. They're trying to organize some new things. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how bias and other related issues can kind of be baked in to these models at the, right at the beginning of how they're built. And to do that, I'm going to just talk. I'll try not be too technical. But I'll try and give like sort of a very high level understanding of how machine models learn. And zooming out a little bit, I think we've talked about machine learning a little bit. Whenever we say AI or artificial intelligence, typically at the best case scenario, that usually means there's a machine learning model for different values of the word best. And machine learning is it's a particular field in computer science where you have models that learn from data. And I'm going to talk about 3 or 4 different ways that these mechanics can lead to bias seeping into the model. And really all of them generally stem from the fact that these models learn by example. You give them some example of something that happened in the past, and it's able to, then the model is used to make some type of prediction about some unseen data example. So I'm going to try and analogize a little bit for this crowd by talking about studying for the bar. I think most folks here have studied for the bar at least once. Maybe some of us have been lucky to study for it several times. But one thing you know ahead of time on the bar generally is the composition of subjects that you're going to be tested for. So for example, there's going to be many more questions on the more core subjects. So let's say you know that the exam is 60% of the questions are going to be torts and contracts. And maybe 5% will be on a more obscure topic like secured transactions. When you're studying for the bar, you don't care where your points come from. You just need to hit a certain score to pass. There's a certain threshold you need to pass. So as a smart studier, you're going to spend most of your time studying torts, studying contracts, and maybe a little bit of time studying secured transactions. It's also possible you could score very well and pass the bar without studying any of those things. And machine learning models, they use a similar optimization strategy when they learn. They have, and I'm going to try and use some fairly simple examples of a machine learning model. So a very common one that you probably all use every day is a spam filter in your email. And what that does is it is trained on examples of emails. Let's say they come in 2 categories, spam and not spam. And it learns what spam emails look like, and it learns an idea of what non-spam emails look like. And eventually it's able to make predictions about emails it's never seen before to a high enough degree of accuracy. So the models basically are fed this data. They make basically, it's almost like your bar examiner or bar examinee doing practice tests on their own. They'll look at a bunch of emails or examples of data, make a bunch of educated guesses, look up the scores and tally up and see how well the model did, and then make adjustments and iterative tweaks from there. And in the real world, a model might do that thousands and thousands of times on millions of data points. And through some math and other things that I'm not going to get into, it actually can come up with a reasonable understanding of perceivable features in the data. And what do I mean by perceivable? That could be objects in an image. It could be some known quality of text, like whether it's a happy sentiment or a negative or sad sentiment, things like that. It only works on perceivable features, and I'll circle back to that in a bit. So the models basically optimize for a metric that's called accuracy. And accuracy sounds like it's really, really good. Who doesn't want to be accurate? But accuracy is a very crude metric. Accuracy is basically calculated by number of correct guesses divided by number of total guesses. So on the bar, if I answered 99 out of 100 questions correctly, my accuracy would be 99. That would be a very good score. But you have to know what I'm guessing. So there's kind of two other metrics that can help you kind of cut through what's actually being guessed. And there's a metric called precision and a metric called recall. So tying this to the spam example, accuracy is of all the predictions that an email was spam, how many of those were correct? Precision is of all the spams that are in the data set that could be guessed, how many did the model find? And what you'll typically find with any machine learning model is there's a direct trade-off between precision and recall. So to make the stakes on that fairly clear for spam filters, it means how many important emails are you willing to miss to live a life without spam? Or by the same token, how many spams are you willing to see, but guarantee that you're not going to miss an important email, right? Those two can be directly in tension. And the engineers who develop these models can actually tune a model to optimize that trade-off. And typically there's not really a mathematical answer to what that optimal trade-off is. That's always rooted in some real world problem. So you can kind of analogize, and I'll leave it to other panelists to talk about maybe some more policy-driven machine learning systems that maybe are a little more important, have deeper impact than spam filters. But basically, one big area that you can have bias seep in is someone made some trade-off between precision and recall that is not optimal for some policy outcome. So one example of that is ShotSpotter. And I can post it in the chat, but they put out a PDF in December of 2020. And it's just kind of talking points, so they don't go in depth, but they say, they have a 0.5% false positive rate. And for folks who aren't familiar, ShotSpotter is a system, and there's other panelists here who can probably explain it much better than I can, but it's a company that has systems of sensors in cities. It listens for ambient noises. Particularly, it tries to seek out and determine where a gunshot was made, and then send that information to law enforcement, and they can decide what to do with that. So they have a 0.5% false positive rate. What that means is every 1,000 times that they predict there's a gunshot, there are 5 instances that was incorrect. So first off, this is taking them at their word. I'm not really going to get into whether or not that's actually correct or not, but when someone presents you that metric, it's important to understand what that is. Now that 0.5% is the result of ShotSpotter making a decision about what precision, what recall is desirable. And I think it's important for policymakers or people interested in this to decide, is 5 out of 1,000 enough? Is that too small? Is that too large? You at least need to understand the metrics and sort of where to move the needle. So basically that's like the first area where basically there's a misalignment of the metrics on what the model was optimized for versus the types of outcomes that the model is leading to in the real world. Related to this is kind of the second bucket, which is some issues with the training data. So with just tying this back to the spam filter example, spammers are crafty. There's maybe always like a new category of spam that could come out every week or every month. So a spam filter that's only trained on one category of spam or certain categories of spam, but a new one was invented this week, that model might fail to detect that as spam. And then, that might destroy your inbox, things like that. And again, other panelists can talk about, sort of more serious systems than spam filters, but the quality of the training data has a direct impact on what the model is able to do. And you want to think about, there's like a sort of a political economy of where the training data comes from. There's an engineer doesn't just say, okay, give me training data. They have to go source it. Usually that means they'll find an existing source for it. If an existing data, sometimes there's open data sets. People have done studies, scholars have done studies on these systems, and sometimes they've been used for years, like maybe even a decade, and then someone looks a little bit deeper and finds just data quality errors. And industrial models have been trained on that data. So there's poor data quality. The data might also just not represent the full picture of what's actually being predicted. Again, if there's some new kind of spam, the models need to be updated to reflect that. The other one that Valerie and Matthew kind of touched on is, I'll just go brief, is kind of re-encoding existing bias. And that's really less of a breakdown in the technology and more from a just total misapplication of technology to that problem, where you have just a very poor and shoddy causal model between some type of data feature and a predicted outcome. So an example that I like to talk about in the coding for lawyers class, I think it illustrates this really well, is Amazon had some type of resume analysis for their hiring, where they associated as an input data feature the resumes of people who worked at Amazon, and their label was the outcome of whether or not that person did well at Amazon. And that system found that the two biggest predictors of success in working at Amazon was being named Jared and having played lacrosse. That's just like an obviously like poor causal model. It really just shows you it just reflects bias that Amazon may have had at that time, or maybe still does. I'm not really going to get into that. But as you can see, like, certain words appearing on a resume may not predict anything, and in the worst case may just kind of re-encode an existing problem. And then finally, on top of all this, a company can a company or anyone putting out a machine learning model into the world, they may do everything right, but even best case scenario, the output of these models are difficult to trace and audit back and explain. I don't know if folks here are familiar, there's a term called deep learning, which is kind of the latest and greatest in technology and machine learning. Anytime you have image recognition or Siri or sound recognition, any of this kind of really high-powered advanced AI and machine learning, that almost certainly is powered by deep learning technologies. It performs really, really well, like generally speaking, for all the benchmark data sets that these models are measured against, they work well. They're also nearly impossible because of their complexity and their design to actually explain why they predicted a certain thing. So if someone is unfortunately on the receiving end of some type of poor prediction in an AI system, they're denied a loan, they're denied a credit card application, something like that, and an AI said that they should be denied. Sometimes the best the company can do is say, well, that's just what the model told us. So that can become even more difficult in criminal justice circumstances. And also, it's just sort of related to this, even if from a tech standpoint, these models can be explained, it's very common for companies to try and closely hold the contents of their model and say they're trade secrets. And it becomes sort of a legal or policy battle just to even get auditability that is already technically feasible. So yeah, so that's really it. Those are just to recap, just 4 things you can think about. You can look at almost any AI or ML system and see if it falls into one of these buckets and use that, even if you don't have a tech background, to kind of scrutinize it. So just see if the model was optimized for some type of metric that doesn't line up with a good public policy outcome. Inspect the quality of the training data or ask about it. Ask if it's a representative sample. Third, check if the causal model is poor and you're just re-encoding something existing. And then finally, if you're talking to a vendor or any government agency that's using this type of model, ask how they can explain the model's findings. And that's it. Thank you.
Thanks, Alan. And we have Claire up next.
Thanks so much, Vienna. So I want to shift us away from the machine a little bit and look at the end user of an AI system or a machine system, and the relationship between the user and the machine, and where bias and error can come into play based on a number of assumptions that we make, or that end users of machines tend to make about various components of that system. I'm going to be using face recognition as the example technology because that is my area of expertise. I focus on the law enforcement use of the technology and its impacts on our rights and liberties in this country, particularly our right to a fair trial and its impacts on due process. So the first assumption that I want to talk a little bit about is this assumption of reliability that's been raised before. And what Alan mentioned, I think, is a perfect encapsulation of one of the things that we hear a lot about in the face recognition space and in other spaces. And that's this idea that one can describe, and we see companies do this and law enforcement agencies do this, describe the reliability of a system in terms of a single metric, that it's X% accurate, that type of thing. And that ignores the nuance behind how these systems work and the choices and the trade-offs that are being made. So to bring Alan's concept of precision and recall back, in the face recognition context, these are decisions not about what is the acceptable threshold for a spam email to make it into your inbox, but what is the acceptable threshold for somebody to be misidentified by a face recognition system to avoid law enforcement missing the potential suspect. Or on the flip side, are we going to set the face recognition system at a point where it, let's say, on average, misses 2% of the actual suspects, because that then avoids a misidentification issue. These are questions that both the developers of these systems and the end user grapple with, and they're not making them necessarily in the context of what is appropriate or ethical or just within our overall policing system. It's usually made in a more clinical evaluation of how many individuals do we want to look through, and what is our risk, our law enforcement agency's own risk threshold for missing a potential suspect in a given case. So going back to the aura or the assumption of reliability, it shows up in a few different ways in the end user. One is this aura of mathematical certainty that Valerie mentioned, this idea that it's a machine, it's math, it must be right. The BBC actually put out a recent article about this, and they used the example of autopilot systems in planes, and this assumption that they're always going to work, and this shock and often to catastrophic results when they don't work. We just have this assumption that autopilot works. And that's not telling you not to ever get on a plane again, but it's a really interesting article looking at, we are almost, no pun intended, hard-coded into believing that machines are reliable. Face recognition is no exception to this. Face recognition has been used in hundreds of thousands of cases, in part to establish the identity of a suspect. And we actually don't have any baseline metric as to how reliable it is as it's used in practice. So the takeaway is there's this assumption of reliability, which is often not established. We often don't have a full understanding as to what the trade-offs between types of accuracy are being made in the back end, or we actually quite simply haven't measured it. But with face recognition, we just haven't measured how reliable it is as it's used by law enforcement in criminal legal cases that lead to people's arrest, charging, incarceration. The second assumption that I want to touch on is the assumption of neutrality. Again, this can be framed as it's math, it's numbers. Math is neutral, right? It's just making predictions. Based on what Alan said, we know that's not true. Based on what Matthew was talking about and Valerie, the inputs highly determine the outputs. But quite apart from how the system's been trained and what the system itself brings to the equation, we also have to look at the system, the environment in which a system is being introduced. Face recognition is not neutral because it's being introduced into our criminal legal system, which is not neutral. The San Diego Association of Governments that used to run the face recognition program for all of San Diego found in an audit that their face recognition and license plate reader systems were used up to 2.5 times more on communities of color than their proportion of the population would suggest. These technologies are used disproportionately on communities of color. Face recognition, because it's paired with mugshot systems a lot of the time, and these are arrest databases, not necessarily conviction databases, will disproportionately run on and therefore only be able to identify particularly young Black men because of the disproportionate focus of our criminal legal system on this demographic. And then lastly, studies do continue to show that face recognition, as with some other tools, perform differently depending on who they are evaluating. With face recognition, having a particularly challenging time with very dark skin, very young people, very old people, and women over men for various reasons, with those an intersectional effect there as well. Young, particularly dark skinned women may be particularly challenging for a system to evaluate. So this assumption of neutrality, not well established, the idea of a neutral system and its impacts must be taken to the environment in which it's being deployed must be taken into account in that evaluation of whether or not a system is in fact neutral. Unfortunately, what we see is that with face recognition, and I think with other systems as well, we see very much a liability hot potato with developers, computer scientists who build these systems being like, we just build the systems. We use this data. How you choose to use it in the real world is not really our problem. Sure, it's a tool. It can be used for bad, it can be used for good. We're just building a tool. The company's saying, hey, we are just selling this tool. It's up to the individuals or the end users to use them. But then on the other side, the end users with face recognition, law enforcement being one of the main users being like, we don't understand accuracy. We don't know what a receiver operating characteristic is. Don't ask us to describe what the acceptable threshold to set our accuracy at so that we're not missing the suspect and not disproportionately coming up with misidentifications. They're like, we're not computer scientists, we're cops. So what we see is that we have this idea of neutrality and no one really wants to touch it because no one wants to assume the responsibility for figuring out that problem and for saying, yes, I understand as a company creating face recognition exactly how this works on different skin tones or on low quality versus high quality images. I will bear the responsibility of training or of trying to compensate for that. Police officers, they have the responsibility determining who they use these tools on and how that's going to exacerbate existing inequities in policing, but nobody's willing to go there. The third assumption is assumption of human competence. And these are all somewhat, there's a lot of interchangeability here. Something we see a lot is this idea that, okay, you got me. Face recognition, other machine may have its bias issues, but don't worry, we have a human in the loop that's going to check and make sure that those biases aren't going to affect anyone. Face recognition systems as used by police always have somebody reviewing the results to determine whether or not there is in fact a match. But what we're doing is we're assuming that person can do that job. Face recognition is a particularly interesting case in this because it's used as a forensic investigative tool. It's closely analogous to how latent fingerprints are processed at a scene, where a latent fingerprint, a latent face, if you will, is collected, compared against a database of face templates, of face prints. A list of possible candidates are returned, and an individual chooses whether or not there's a match. With fingerprints, you have a highly trained forensic expert performing that process. They have been certified in latent fingerprint examination. There's no such thing as a forensic face examiner. There's no such thing as a certification program for those individuals in this country. And as a consequence, we assume that the human in the loop is a valuable check against misidentification, but we've actually never taken a step back and said, is the end user of a machine system competent to identify how the system might make errors and to adequately check against that? And with face recognition, they're not. Absent training, absent a certification or an expert evaluation process, humans are actually not very good at looking at thousands of photos of people they don't know, often from multiple different years, and determining whether or not they're the same person. And then the last assumption that I was actually just thinking of when listening to the other panelists talking about is this assumption that efficiency is a good thing. Face recognition and a lot of these systems are overwhelmingly talked about as like, this is just business as usual, but more efficient. This is removing a laborious human process to make policing, housing determinations more efficient. And when we're looking at the discriminatory effects of the use of these systems, we have to look at whether efficiency is actually a good end goal, or whether incarcerating more people for low-level quality of life crimes is a good thing, or whether that's going to not just be the machine going to be enrolled into a discriminatory policing system, but is it going to actually exacerbate that by making policing low-level crimes more efficient and therefore worth it for law enforcement to perpetuate? So I'm going to leave it there. I've realized I've raised far more questions than answers, but hopefully that's the next part of this talk.
Thanks, Claire. And up next, you have Nassim.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Claire. Yes, I'm Nassim Moshri. I'm Policy Director with the ACLU DC. And first, I want to say that, Claire, I'm absolutely never flying again. I haven't flown in 2 years, and that did it. I can't trust autopilot. Okay, sorry, to be serious. I know we only have a little bit of time left. Also a disclaimer, I also am not a technology expert. I'm, a policy person, but we've heard a lot today about how algorithms are used and can be abused to discriminate and significantly harm people in a variety of ways. History has shown that powerful secret surveillance algorithms and tools will almost certainly be used for political reasons and turned disproportionately on Black people and people of color. And the consequences of not guarding against these harms is profound, including by leading to the deprivation of liberty when law enforcement involved, to significant risk of bodily injury or death at the hands of police. And so a question that the ACLU and others have been grappling with for the past decade or so is how communities can keep up with the rapid expansion of the use of AI and other types of surveillance technology by state and local governments. So, as we've been hearing, modern technologies, they collect sensitive information about our private lives, often without our knowledge or consent. They can easily be used to discriminate, to invade privacy, to chill First Amendment freedoms. And the databases, the data that's collected from these technologies are also vulnerable to breach and exploitation, including by private companies, but also by federal agencies like immigration and customs enforcement, for example, that can lead to deportation of people. And yet the status quo in DC and in most of the country is that local police departments and other local agencies are able to make decisions about using this type of technology, about acquiring it unilaterally and in secret. I am going to pause for a second and ask you all if you're hearing the ringing in the background of my apartment. I can't get to it. It's downstairs. My husband left his phone on. I don't know. I think it's an alarm. So apologies. I hope you can hear me better than that, but I just wanted to address that I too hear it. I know it's there. Anyway, so, oh good, it looks like, oh no, it's still going. Okay, so, so this is, we know what the risks are. But the status quo is still like allowing this to happen, and ordinary community members don't have, who are impacted by this technology, are not part of the deliberations. They don't get to have a say in what safeguards the government has to have in place to protect privacy, to protect other civil rights and civil liberties. But also they don't have a say in the threshold question of whether these surveillance technologies should be used at all by the government. And the law, of course, as we've been hearing, has just not been able to keep up with the pace of the technology, both the development of technology, but also the expansion in use of the technology. So when we think of solutions to this problem, the first step, of course, is to think about educating ourselves as community members, so raising public awareness about how these tools are used, and generally working to remove the secrecy and I like to call the unknowability of these technologies, which for lay people like most of us can make it feel daunting to try to tackle this issue, and also could make us feel like we should just trust that the technologies say what the companies are saying they do, or that the technologies do what the companies are saying that they do. So that education piece is really critical. I think this panel is part of that. So thanks to the Washington Council of Lawyers for doing this, to having this robust, public discussion about the impact of technologies. But then to get beyond transparency and get to accountability, we have to develop legal frameworks within which we can have these conversations in a meaningful way and actually change how things are going. So the ACLU DC, we convene a local coalition called the Community Oversight of Surveillance DC, or COSDC campaign. It's how we're hoping to achieve this specifically with regard to government use of technology. And the goal of this campaign is to shift decisions about government use of surveillance to community members through their democratically elected representatives in the DC Council. And in general terms, what the legislation would do is it would require local district agencies to divulge the surveillance technology they're currently using, or that they plan to acquire, they plan to use, to the DC Council and the public, and they have to seek council approval for each use of each specific technology. And how they would do this is the agencies would essentially provide reports to the council detailing how the technology works, its planned purpose and use, its anticipated impact on communities, what privacy protective measures the agency is planning to take to protect residents. And then the council would have a public hearing to gather community input, after which the council could then vote on whether to approve that specific use of the technology. And if they do approve it, what sort of regulations or what sort of limitations to place on the use of that technology by the agency. The legislation would also require the creation of an independent privacy advisory body that would include experts in this technology, would include experts and advocates in civil rights and civil liberties. And most importantly, it would include members from communities that have historically been impacted by police surveillance, by police violence, to advise the DC Council and the agencies on different technologies. And to date, 21 jurisdictions around the country have passed similar legislation. This is really inspired by a broader national effort, the national CCOPS effort that started in around 2016. And I will just end with this. This is just one method of having this framework will allow us as a community to have these discussions in a really meaningful and in-depth way. When we talk to agency officials, I think Claire sort of touched on this too, lots of folks who work in government agencies who are using this technology don't really even understand how it works, and are also just trusting that the information that they're getting is right. And they don't even know how to go about really, figuring out how to make it safer and more effective, or how to think about whether they should be using it at all. And so this sort of provides that kind of framework. And I will end by saying that, our effort, the COSDC effort, is really part of a larger effort to dismantle the surveillance state, the harms of the surveillance state. And it's not just about ending unchecked surveillance of communities, but it's really tied to decentering police, moving away from this incarceral heavy sort of system that also Claire touched on about, do we want to be putting people in jail for these like low level offenses? And it's really about getting us away from that and investing directly in communities.
Thank you so much, Nasim. We have a few minutes now for questions. To what Claire said earlier, there are clearly a lot of unanswered questions in this space. We had one come in the Q&A, but if you have any questions, feel free to put them in there. Claire, I don't know if you wanted to add a little bit to that question that was put in the Q&A about how facial recognition is used in investigations, while we wait to see if we have any more come in.
Sure, yeah. So face recognition is typically an element of an investigation, but here again, without clearly defining how it relates to the broader investigative process, officers aren't often told what constitutes sufficient additional investigation. In theory, an officer can go to, I don't know, a palm reader, a tarot card reader to get an investigative lead. They can't use that as probable cause to make an arrest. They can use a face recognition system, but what additional evidence do they need to collect has not been defined. What we're seeing in cases is that they're using information that's not permissible, like asking a non-witness to make an ID, and then trying to introduce a witness ID as the identification into court, even though the person wasn't a witness to the crime, or doing a single photo array. Again, not a permissible ID procedure, but they're saying that that's sufficient corroboration. What that's proven, what the consequence of that is that it's been face recognition use in investigations has been completely hidden from the defense. We have no idea which cases it's been used in over the last 20 years, in part because it is considered this investigative lead. So it leads to another piece of evidence that's then used to make the arrest, to get the charging document. But we don't know how reliable that process was.
Thanks, Claire. I think we have time for probably one more question. If anyone has one, they can pop into Q&A. Give it a second. Yeah, go ahead, Christina.
While we are waiting to see if there's one final question, I do want to thank our panelists very much. Thank you, Vienna, for leading us through a fantastic conversation. I hope all of you now come out at the other end of this program thinking this is important. It's important in all the areas of the law. I hope you will take opportunity to educate yourself about what the consequential issues of using this technology is, and that we have helped you be a better advocate. And I will point out there's one last question at an individual level, and then it just disappeared. At an individual level, what can we be doing to combat this for our clients? Anyone want to be the last word on that one? Nassim, that seems like maybe that might be your area of expertise.
I honestly don't have an answer. I don't know the answer, so Claire might actually be better.
One thing which might sound completely counter to this panel is don't think of this as AI, don't think of this as machine learning and scary things that you don't understand. In the legal context, this is business as usual. Think about with face recognition, think about all the flaws with eyewitness. Think about all the forensic identification procedures that should be in place. Are they in place with face recognition? Think about this is a tool, to use that very annoying analogy that we hear a lot. This is a tool. Is it being used within an already a biased system to perpetuate that bias system? Is it adding new bias? Ignore the machine learning stuff if that scares you, if it feels like beyond your competence. I'm not a computer scientist, so I like saying this. Bring this down to what you feel comfortable discussing and what is within your level of expertise, because it very much is. And that's also what the judge needs to hear. They don't love cases of first impression. They want to hear how this is business as usual, just with a little bit of a problematic twist on it, if that makes any sense whatsoever.
That is fantastic. I will say we have lots more to come in DC Pro Bono Week. There are opportunities to be hands-on and volunteer and work with clients. And maybe you will see some of these issues. There are opportunities for other discussions, and there are opportunities for you to see what pro bono opportunities are out there for you. So I will say once again, thank you to our panelists, and happy Pro Bono Week, everyone.